I really wanted to make this video, but I'm a little bit torn because I'm kind of sick. But I was thinking about this all of yesterday and I made a bunch of notes for it and I got a really good idea of what I wanted to do. So maybe we'll just do a happy middle where I'll talk about it, but it won't be an overly long video. Like, I'm not going to make this 20, 30 minutes, I think. We're just going to introduce the idea and then give you guys a general introduction to this whole how to think recursively thing. So, first of all, I have my site pulled up here. We're not going to be going through this, but this is just with regard to the framework itself, the recursive framework. This is the beginner's guide that I've constructed, and we actually have an easier one too. Hold on, let me pull that up. We have a super simple guide that is probably even more ideal for someone who's just looking to get into the framework. But I only had that pulled up because I needed to have something in the background. This isn't going to be going through the framework itself. It's just going to be a general discussion or a general overview of what this whole thinking recursively even means. Because I would imagine most people, when they see a title like this or they hear something like this, they don't know exactly what that all entails. And that's completely understandable because the whole idea of recursion self-reference hasn't really permeated the general discussion yet, like the cultural conversation. And I like to make predictions. So one of the predictions that I'm going to make is that truth or that observation is not going to be the case for long. I'd say give it 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe it'll take a few years, but within a fairly relatively short time frame, I predict we're going to hear this word, this concept of recursion pop up everywhere. And it's not a new concept at all. It's actually been around for, well, decades, but it was really introduced to the intellectual landscape in the 80s, I think, with Hofstadter's book. He wrote Gödel Escher Bach, and that's a pretty intense, in-depth book. It's one of my favorites. Anyone who has an idea about recursion is probably familiar with that book, but it's super long and it's a whole nother beast. So that was what, 40 years ago, and he introduced some really, really fantastic ideas. But there's some people who really deeply engaged with the ideas, but they were never ever really translated or extended into a wider interpretation of like science or the intellectual landscape in general. No one really ever took that next step. So part of what this theory is it is that next step. It's taking this idea of self-reference or recursion. He has a specific definition of recursion, but we purify that definition and we say straight out that when we talk about this word recursion, all we mean is self-reference. That's it. It's as simple, as base, as pure of a definition as you could possibly get. And that's intentional. We want to keep it that way. So that's just a little bit of background. And we're going to make a video on the timeline for this framework, and then the timeline for recursion in the intellectual landscape more generally, because that'll be helpful and that'll be pretty interesting, I think. But I just wanted to lay out that context so you guys can understand where this is coming from and what we are talking about when it comes to the whole recursion thing. So, yeah, if you're watching, you guys heard it here first. You may have seen my other videos, so you may know vaguely what I'm talking about. But that's the prediction we're making. This is timestamped. We have timestamps going back 6 months where I make similar predictions, but now it's in YouTube format. I mean, I already had the intro videos for the theory, but if you haven't heard it, you've heard it now. Within the next few years, recursion is going to be everywhere. And maybe it will have a different label. Maybe it will have been appropriated differently. And I know that's such an audacious claim, but I have strong faith and strong confidence based solely on the stuff that I've been seeing within the past few months. So, how to think recursively? What even does that mean? And what are we getting into here? I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for you guys. You know how I like to complicate things. But again, when we talk about the definition of recursion, here's what you should think about. You should think about if self-reference doesn't make intuitive sense, because I know it's a little paradoxical, that's the point, because at its core, self-reference is a sort of paradox. we've talked about feedback loops in our last couple of videos. Self-reference is a form of a feedback loop, or I should say more accurately, feedback loops and paradox and iteration. Those ideas are all expressions of this more fundamental term that is self-reference. So you might have seen that famous picture or that meme where, or anything really that shows a mirror inside a mirror inside a mirror, and then it extends on for infinity. And that's pretty apt because the idea of infinity itself actually has a lot to do with this concept as well. And we're not going to get into the infinite aspect because that starts to break your brain when you spend too much time thinking about it. And it does require a little bit of technical background because it gets into Gödelian incompleteness and like Cantor and this abstract math that I have no interest in doing for this YouTube video. If you want, you can read about all that on my site because I write about it very in depth. But you can take this very simple surface level understanding of self-reference by tying it to these ideas of feedback loops, infinity, paradox, and anything that refers to itself, anything that layers iteratively on itself. So the idea is so fundamental, it is so basic that it's actually difficult to wrap your mind around. It's very difficult to understand intuitively at first. But my belief is once you actually grasp it, once you start to understand the idea more purely in its purest sense, I think you just see it everywhere. And then you can start to understand how everything, all your interactions, everything in your life and your surroundings can be tied to this idea of self-reference in some way. Some are more obvious than others. But I want to get into the psychological aspect of how all that works because I want to teach you how to think in a way that you can use to your advantage. So I'm not just trying to confuse people. I'm actually trying to put this into a coherent framework that helps people understand themselves more deeply. And here's what I'll start off by saying. Uh, I'm sure a lot of you, if you like have found this channel or you like listening to what I have to say, you're probably already in a minority. But I would also assume there's a good chance you already think recursively to some degree. And how do you think in a self-referential way? How does that even make sense? It's a great question. When I say that, imagine like a devil's advocate. That's a good way to understand recursive thinking or self-referential thinking is in terms of being a devil's advocate. Or more specifically, you are a sort of chronic devil's advocate. You might continuously assess things from a meta level. Like you have an idea or you're in an exchange, and then your natural instinct, your like habitual impulse is to step out of that frame and to view it from another perspective. That is, in a very basic sense, recursive thinking. So, like we just said, when you're doing whatever, you're going about your life, you're having a discussion, you're engaging with ideas. If you are someone who tends to automatically seek that wider lens or that wider perspective, it's a pretty general description, but that's a good indication that to some degree you're already thinking pretty recursively. And I believe, well, I want to tie this to like an actual psychological profile here. I think that from this idea of recursive thinking or self-referential patterns in your way of thinking, that branches off into potentially two routes. I guess maybe three, because the third one is a balanced behavior between the first two. But I see it as like the pros and the cons side to what happens when you actually start thinking in this way, or you become acutely aware of yourself thinking in this way. Because most people, they do it, it's their natural mode of cognition, but they're not thinking about their mode of cognition. That's just how their brain works. So if that's you, hopefully this can be a tool to understand your own mode of thinking and then leverage that to become more effective and a more effective thinker. So, like I said, this branches off into two routes: the pro, the good, like the benefits, and then the bad or the inhibitory route, I guess I would call it. And we'll start with that latter one. There are obviously many advantages, but there are just as many disadvantages when your brain works in this way. So it can actually become a pretty dangerous thing, even more dangerous when you're not aware of it. Because, again, going back to this constant devil's advocate example, when you think in this way and you're more negatively minded, so to speak, then what happens is when you have this frame of mind and you're constantly deferring to an external perspective, just in a I want the whole picture type of sense. So that is a good thing. But what can also happen is when you're constantly doing that, it can become a neurotic tendency. So this manifests in all kinds of ways. But when you hear someone say, like, I'm a chronic overthinker, or I'm hyperanalyze everything, I overthink everything, or just people who are uber skeptical about everything, these all tie into this idea of the constant negative way of recursive thinking. Your brain works quickly, or your brain works on different levels. Then the natural habit for many people can be to always see the potential negative or the potential downside in every given situation or experience, because those downsides exist, but your mind naturally gravitates toward perceiving them. So it's actually pretty simple. You're overthinking things because your brain is thinking too much in a way. And instead of balancing out that recursive mindset, you are falling into the worst possible, the worst case perception. And again, I think everyone actually does this to a certain degree. Everyone has these times, or they have habits of overthinking or hyper analyzing certain situations. But the point in phrasing it this way is to understand and to show people that it's not necessarily a pathological thing. It's not always a deficiency. Like, it's healthy to be able to perceive the negative in future situations and future states and potential actions and behaviors. That's a good thing. It's like a survival mechanism. We've evolved to have that capability. So for some people, that's just your brain overthinking things. It's thinking too much in a negative way. And this all boils down to one point and one danger that I think is the thing to watch out for. And I fall victim to this. This characterizes how I think so often. When you get into this state, to this mindset too frequently, or it's your natural mode of thinking and you don't have a way to step out of it, what will happen and what will become like a tendency for you is it will turn into an inhibitory quality. Like, it will prevent you from acting or from doing certain things that you otherwise would naturally do, from taking risks that you otherwise need to take, because you are too acutely aware of everything that could possibly go wrong, all of the downsides. It's hyperneuroticism in the most classic sense. You're unable to do things that might be actually good for your human development because you're too aware of what failing those things or what the downside of those things might look like. So it's a super fine line. You want to have that awareness. You want to be forward thinking about risks to make sure you're making the optimal decisions, but that can actually have like an overcompensation effect. Just like the pendulum swinging back and forth too far to one side, it tends to correct. And this is your brain in that capacity in action. It's displaying that same type of phenomenon. And the other aspect of this, of the recursive thinking, the over self-referential thinking, is just the flip side. It's heaviness on openness to experience. So because you are able to think forwardly about all these things, some people have that same tendency, but they do it in a positive fashion. So everything they think about, they're conceptualizing all these experiences, but instead of seeing the risk, you are seeing the upside, and you are seeing the benefits, and you're seeing the desirable aspects to doing these things. And I think that's better. You want to have that to a degree because that's the mechanism that allows you to take risks and to embark on new experiences and to just do things that would otherwise make you uncomfortable because you are aware of the potential benefits. So it's the exact opposite of that neurotic quality. They're two sides to the same coin, the same self-referential cognition, but it can branch off into one of two ways. You can be overthinking on the negative and you can be overthinking on the positive. And the positive is ideal, like I said, but that can also lead to you, well, it's kind of obvious now, isn't it? It can also lead to you taking too many risks. Too much openness to experience can result in you lacking that certain risk preventative awareness. So it's the exact opposite. And my argument is that there is a middle of the road between those two avenues simply by recognizing both of those avenues exist. Once you realize that, if you're like a hyper recursive thinker, either one direction or the other, very few people are balanced in the middle, in my experience. Some of them are, and they're highly successful, they're highly productive people. But most people that I meet, and I'm sure it's an anecdotal thing, and I myself am toward the more neurotic side, but most people that I meet and know and communicate with are one or the other. So, my recommendation, we might be getting up to 20 minutes here, and I said I wasn't going to do that. But my recommendation and the thing that I'm trying to convey in this video, if you think one of these ways, either you're more optimistic or you're more negative, once you realize that it's a natural and the brain tends to gravitate towards one or the other, you can establish a mechanism within your mind, or just like a sprite on the shoulder, so to speak, that helps you navigate in between those things. So you have like a reminder, a mental reminder that tries to correct when you are aware of yourself drifting in that one direction. And all it is like a meta filter that says, hey, do the stuff that you need to do, that you want to do, but don't overthink it. It's as simple as that. It's easy to overthink, and it's easy to jump on opportunities. Think it through, form a basic risk assessment, and then don't let that perception spiral, because then that will prevent you from doing the normal things that you probably should be doing. But you can also choose your battles wisely and have a healthy, balanced perspective about the stuff that you should be doing and the stuff that you should be engaging in. And that's the basic, the super service level understanding of how a recursive mindset works. When your brain layers thoughts on itself, that's what metacognition is, that's what meta recursion is. It tends to spiral or iterate in one direction. And it's more rare for someone to be perfectly balanced. We're just imperfect creatures, but you can improve your normal cognitive faculties to a certain degree simply by realizing this. And I don't want to confuse you, because you can have the risk too of overthinking all of this, and then it defeats the purpose. You're overthinking having the meta filter, so you're like, that defeats the purpose. Just be aware of these possibilities, be aware of the type of thinker you are, and then try to balance that out in any situation where it's relevant. It can be a super basic thing, and I think I'm running the risk of over explaining it right now, but it's just an awareness. So hopefully, if you are a recursive thinker, this kind of helps show you that it's natural, and that's all I'm trying to demonstrate. Be aware. Don't let yourself be cut off from certain decisions, but still be smart in your behaviors and your actions. And I hate this because it sounds like I'm like a teacher or a preacher. No, it's just, this is how I am, this is how I think, and this is what I've learned. And it's been extremely helpful for me, to the extent that you can actually leverage something like this and use it to reduce the angst, the neuroticism. Act more, think less. And that is my advice to you guys for this video. So thanks for hanging in there. I know I'm sick. Yeah, my brain is a little bit more all over the place today. I feel like I've been rambling. But this was an important video for me, and then hopefully it just introduces this idea of recursive psychology at a very surface level. And we'll talk more about this because it gets way more interesting. So thanks again.